first Central States Conference that I can remember attending was in '72 in Chicago. I'm not sure that it in fact was the first one I attended, but it's the first one that I remember. I have been to almost every one since then. I've had to miss 2 of them, I think, for family-related reasons. And I've always enjoyed the conference. It's big enough to have a pretty rich array of programs and opportunities. It's small enough that you don't get overwhelmed and you have an opportunity to visit with people and see people. As I was moving up through the academic ranks, when I became department chair at Northwestern, in those years the chairs of all of the Big Ten departments would always meet at Central States and exchange information about graduate student stipends and budget pressures and this and that. So I was regularly involved in the convention all of those years, whether or not I was on the program of the convention. As I moved up the ranks, I was invited to serve on one or another of the committees of the association, and continued to be involved in the conferences, and I published 2 or 3 things in the journal. And then somewhere along the way in the mid-'80s, the nominating committee asked me to run for what was then called vice president. It's now second vice president, but that then started the chain of moving up through the offices. Well, the thing I remember most about the conventions in those years, I mean, aside from being kind of intimidated by seeing in the flesh people whose names that I was reading about.
Sitting across the chair from them.
The thing that I remember is that they were places where very distinguished senior scholars and junior scholars would meet and interact, and it was a very welcoming kind of environment. There wasn't the same degree of distance from some of the most well-known people that there was at the National Convention, for example. And because the convention was smaller, it could meet in a wider range of cities, and so I'd get familiar with places that I hadn't been to or hadn't spent much time at, like Minneapolis or Kansas City or places like that. It was right as I came into the presidency that we became aware of very serious financial problems with the association, the nature of which we couldn't really understand, and at first misdiagnosed. We had a strange system in those years where membership renewals were tied to the appearance of the journal. So if the journal fell behind, people wouldn't get billed for membership renewals, which of course left the association with depleted resources, and it got to the point where it couldn't pay to have the journal published, which of course was a vicious spiral. And so we thought that the problem was an accounting problem, that if we could correct by getting off of this cycle of tying memberships to journals and getting people's billing up to date, that we would be just fine. It turned out the problem was much more sinister than that, as you've probably heard, and it involved criminal wrongdoing on the part of an executive secretary of the association. But we figured out pretty fast that if we didn't do something, the association would go under, because we were on a spiral where we couldn't collect revenue, we couldn't pay bills, and so we had to figure out what to do about it. And so it took my presidential year and then some. First of all, investigating, getting to the root of what the problem was, and discovering it, and trying to work out a short-term fix that would get us back into a decent financial position. And we ended up going to NCA and saying, we need you to help us, laying out the problem as we thought it existed, and saying, we need you to lend us some money. Well, NCA appropriately was skeptical, particularly since what was going to secure this loan? What would be the collateral of the loan? They'd never done anything like this before. They certainly didn't think of themselves as being in the loan business. If anything, they were having some of their own problems because they had money invested in one of the savings and loans that was in trouble at that time, but we didn't know that in Central States. So there was a lot of going back and forth and working through this, And finally, after several people represented us very effectively within NCA, NCA agreed to make a loan, and we had asked for $22,000, which we figured was what it would cost to get us back into a regular journal production cycle and then a billing cycle.
Right.
And NCA agreed to that loan if members of Central States would personally guarantee it.
I think that's so cool. I love this story.
So the next thing I had to do as president is I had to take these terms and make them work.
Right.
And so I solicited a number of people. I said, look, we don't want your money. What we want you to do is to guarantee part of this loan.
Right.
So we got these 24 notes, and NCA agreed to the loan. And of course, as this was happening, as I said, we were uncovering what the real problem was, and ultimately pursuing some legal remedies that got us some partial measure of restitution. But we never got back all of what we had lost. But the positive of the story is, once it became clear that Central States was getting back on track, the membership responded very positively. So people who were billed for back dues pretty much brought themselves current. The membership began to grow as it was clear that there was activity. And as a result of the very good management of our own then Executive Secretary, Larry Miller, we were able to take out only $15,000 of this loan.
Oh, wow.
And we were able to pay it back a year and a half ahead of schedule.
That's great.
And in fact, it was at one of our conventions, I think in Kansas City, in which at the luncheon we publicly burned these these 24 notes, and had a party, and it was
I would love to see photos from them.
it was a delightful end to what was really a pretty perilous story.